Okay, so today there was a question in the Elementor Facebook community regarding ways to, or the pros and cons of setting elements to inline within a column for a layout instead of creating multiple columns. And I do like this approach. I agree with this approach for many things. It's not always the best approach, but in many cases it is. There's lots of pros and cons. I'm only going to talk today about the layout pros and cons, nothing to do with DOM size or number of elements, etc. So what I've done is created 3 demos here showing different ways of dealing with this. In the first demo, I've just got a description up here. Now my column has a standard Elementor padding, which is 10 pixels. I've got some lorem ipsum text here, which is justified so I get right to the edges. And then I've got another column underneath here, standard Elementor 10 pixel padding again. And what I've done is on the buttons, you can use anything, I've just used buttons for this description. You could use any element you like. All I've done is put a 0.5 rem padding on the right and on the bottom. So if we have a look in here, at the actual button. In fact, that's incorrect. I've put a 1 rem padding on the bottom and on the right. So the idea is that it pushes the next button along by 1 rem. When it wraps around here, we get a 1 rem spacing between the top and the bottom. So I'm just going to update that and refresh and have a look how our first section performs. There it is there. So you can see with this approach, my buttons line up perfectly with the edge of this content, but not on the right hand side here. Now if I move this in, I get some wrapping, so the buttons, when it gets too wide for that row, the flex automatically wraps it around to the next row, but we end up with more white space here. That obviously changes as we move that. So this edge gets closer, and then all of a sudden we get more wrapping again. And that's a typical problem with this. So what you can do is, if you want to, you can set your column horizontal line to space between, but see we're still off by 1 rem there because I've got a 1 rem on the right. And I can't target this element because on a different screen size it might be this one that wraps or that one that wraps. So that's not a good way of doing it. So if this design works for you, that's great, but just be aware you're going to end up with some white space on the right hand side here. So this is where, if that is an issue, columns might be a better approach because you can put some color on each column, and no matter how wide it is or the screen, you can control how that's going to look, and then the contents within it don't really matter as much. So that's one approach. Approach number 2 is, again, we've got standard padding on this column here, which is our reference. Got standard padding on this column, and what we're doing here is we're setting our horizontal line to space between for this column, and then we're just putting a margin on the bottom of 1 rem. We're not putting anything on the right. So we know we're not trying to space these with using marginal padding. It is the space between that's doing that. So let's have a look at how that works. Refresh this page. Sure. So go to our next setting here. So here we've got our columns here. So the left hand side of this lines up perfectly with our content. The right hand side lines up perfectly with our content. You might notice straight away that we've got different spacing here than we've got between them. Interesting. So if we now go in further, we get to a point where we've only got 4 of these on there, and now we've got bigger space between than here. That's our standard spacing. But because we've got space between, which basically wraps what it can't fit on a row around to the next row, it takes the first element of that row, sticks it on the left, the last element sticks it on the right, and whatever the contents, it spaces them even in between. So we go further down, we get to 3. And now they're perfectly symmetrical, but we've got a lot of spacing here. So again, we're at a different design than what we actually desire. So if I go just to this point here, what have I got there? If I just go there we go, just where it wraps. No, not quite getting it. So anyway, so that's basically approach number 2. Approach number 3, come down here, I'll just put some colouring around this to make it a bit easier to see, is again, I've changed the padding on the column up here to a padding of 1 rem all the way around. The column below it, I've changed the padding on that to 0.5 rem all the way around, and then on the buttons I've set the padding all the way around of 0.5. So with the padding of the column and the padding of the button, I end up with 1 rem, which means our content aligns correctly here. Again, I've got space between, so the content on the last item lines up with the content above it. So let's have a look at how that behaves. It's our last section here. So there's our content. And as I mentioned, this edge lines up perfectly with the content above it. So does this edge. We still have different amount of space there than we've got vertically. So let's go in. So now we're getting closer with our space horizontally and vertically. Get to a point where it wraps around, we've got more space again, and again we've got the 2 wrapped items, one at the beginning and the other one at the end. Not ideal. So the way to fix that again is to change the column layout to the default or start, which is the same thing, and let's see what that does. Okay, so now we've got perfect spacing, perfect spacing horizontally and vertically. That all looks good. We get to our widest screen, and because these are all inline auto, it's the width of the content. So it's the text and the padding that's in that button in this case. So these are just automatically sized. They're not going to add up to the exact amount of width that we want. So this is just something we have to be aware of. So that doesn't line up to this edge, it lines up at the beginning. As we wrap around, they go to the beginning, so we don't end up with this weird spacing where we have one here and one at the end, but we still have the issue of the spacing being not going all the way to the end, which, look, I'm okay with. So what typically you might look at for this is, as an example instead here, let's just duplicate this. I'm going to take out all of these buttons actually. Okay, I might actually set this to, in the column, I'll set it to, for the horizontal line, I'll set that to center. Oops, wrong one, center. And then we'll just duplicate this. And duplicate it again. Duplicate again. And duplicate again. Okay, just to be fancy, I'm going to then change the background of one of these to maybe a dull down primary. Copy that and stick it over there. Okay, let's see what that looks like. So again, I'm not talking about the pros and cons of how much file size we have or DOM elements or whatever. This is purely talking about rows and columns. And this here is Inline Auto, and this is actually using columns. So if I shrink that down, see we get there, and now we've still got the buttons all in a row in like this. Again, we might change some sizing. Then we get to the mobile breakpoint where it goes to 100%, which we might make those full width or whatever. So in some cases, using the columns is actually going to be a better design decision, because we can actually make these fit better. I can actually, on all of these, even if we made those full width of the column, that might even scale better. So in some cases this makes more sense than using this method. I mean, I do like the use of it. I think it has some benefit. You can also change, where are we? Say for example on this one here, there is some flex settings, I think. Have a look here. No, there's not. There's no wrapping on here. But you could change the flex direction on this to row, and it will actually scale all of this rather than wrapping it. But you have to do that with custom CSS with the sections and columns. With the new flex boxes, it's all included as part of the UI, so it's a lot easier. But in this case, it's more difficult. So yeah, so that's basically some ponderings on that. There is an alternative. So recently, Reno from Living with Pixels, he put up a video on YouTube, which he's going to expand on, I believe. It's actually a pretty good video. Now, Reno's a proper graphic designer. I'm not a proper graphic designer. I am a bit of a hack with it, so to be quite blunt. I'm just pondering. Reno does this for a living, and probably has more insight than what I do. But I'm just putting up some ideas for thought. So he's made this video, and he's come up with the idea of a 1120 pixel grid inside the 1140 pixel width. And if you want it to be fixed widths, you can actually say if you want three there with 20 pixel margins in between, or padding in between, whatever, spacing. You can set that to 360 pixels on each of these. If you want 4, you set them to 265. The problem with that for me is that when you shrink the screen size, this will wrap around and you end up with all this white space there anyway. So they all have their pros and cons, and I don't think there's a single answer to this for design. I think it really needs to fit your design, but having different ideas in your toolkit as to how you can achieve these things, I think is great. There isn't a single answer, unfortunately, so it's just a matter of knowing what you can do and then applying what fits the design, I think. Anyway, so that's my thoughts, and I hope that is something that you can take something away from. Okay, thank you.